And with that said, I would like to introduce you, my very good friend, and our next presenter, Dr. Terry Daniel. Allow me to share my screen to give a proper introduction. Now, Dr. Daniel's presentation today is called Bereavement and Bad Theology, a Toxic Cocktail. Dr. Daniel is an interfaith and interspirituality hospice chaplain, end-of-life educator, and grief counselor certified in death, dying, and bereavement by the Association of Death Education and Counseling. She is also certified in trauma support by the International Association of Trauma Professionals. She conducts workshops throughout the U.S. and teaches at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. Dr. Daniel is also the founder of the Conference on Death, Grief, and Belief, as well as the Ask Dr. Death podcast, both of which you must check out. It's incredible work what she's doing. She's also the author of 4 books on death, grief, and beyond. So, Dr. Daniel, thank you so much for being with us today and doing this for us. I will turn it over to you. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And, listening to my introduction, you are probably thinking, what is a hospice chaplain doing at an atheist conference? And in order to answer that question, I'm going to start by first defining what a chaplain is. It's not a minister. It's not a pastor. It's not anything like that. Most people confuse those two things. When somebody says, when you're in the hospital and they say, would you like the chaplain to visit you? You're picturing Father Mulcahy from MASH in his clerical collar with his Bible and his big cross that he's wearing. That's not what a chaplain is. In fact, that's a Catholic priest. Chaplaincy is actually supposed to be about being religiously neutral. So it doesn't matter if you're Buddhist, Jewish, Christian, atheist, whatever. When you are a clinical chaplain working in a hospital or hospice, or even in a prison or police department and other places where chaplains work, you leave your personal theology at the door. And you go in and you talk to that person who is dying or who's ill or who's traumatized, and you meet them where they are theologically. Now, this is really challenging. This is the hardest thing for chaplaincy students to deal with because, everybody has their personal theology. And for me personally, I pretty much, to be honest, have a lot of disdain for most religious doctrine. So it's been quite a challenge, for me to be spiritually and religiously neutral. But that's what I do. And why is a hospice chaplain here at an atheist conference? Well, the answer is because as I gained more and more experience working with dying and grieving people, I was able to verify something I had already suspected. And it was that bad theology makes the experience of dealing with loss and trauma and grief worse. So that became sort of my passion all through graduate school, and my doctoral dissertation was on toxic theology as a contributing factor in complicated grief. So when I was doing my research, I could find tons of papers, tons of, big body of work on toxic theology. That exists, that research has been done. And I could find tons of research on complicated grief, and I'll explain to you what complicated grief is in a minute. But I didn't see anything that linked the two together. So, starting with the research that existed, and most of you guys are theologians, and in philosophy departments, you're probably not familiar with the major grief researchers, so I'm not going to drop their names. But what they've come up with, just in summary, is that there is positive religious coping and negative religious coping. That in some cases, religious coping is helpful, and in some cases, it's not. We now are beginning to get a lot of research on the cases in which it's not. And the problem with the research is that the language is so ambiguous. So for example, in a lot of the studies that have been done on religious coping, where they've interviewed dying people or people in hospitals, the questions they would ask in the surveys are, do you believe in God? Do you go to church? Do you have a spiritual community? Where these questions are useless because they don't actually define somebody's theological outlook. If someone asked me, do I believe in God? I would say, what do you mean by God? And let's come up with a definition, and then maybe I can answer your question. Do I go to church? No. Lots of people don't go to church, but they still believe in some sort of religious structure. So the research is really flawed in general, but it's getting there. And what we're seeing, let me just see if I can find some of this research here to show you. Well, I'll come back to that. We have been able to break it down into positive and negative religious coping. So positive religious coping could be, for example, somebody gets a terminal diagnosis and they go into perhaps mystical states, meditation, envisioning the part of their body that has cancer and sending healing energy and love and picturing the colon nice and healthy. And that's, kind of a meditation process. Some positive religious coping can be, okay, I see that this has happened to me. God probably has something in mind that's above my comprehension, but I'll go along with it because I have faith in God. As opposed to negative religious coping, which would be God is punishing me. That's why he gave me cancer at 42 years old. Or the devil is creating this cancer. Or God is testing me because I haven't been faithful enough, because I've questioned my religion. So all that's in the negative religious coping column. And so this is what we see when we work with death and loss and grief. I'm going to give you some case examples in a little bit. I'm also going to talk about the difference between embedded and deliberative theology. Some of you may have heard of these terms before. And I'm going to talk about Fowler's stages of faith development that some of you might also be familiar with. So the thing about religion is that most religious beliefs, and I'm not necessarily saying like church doctrines, but concepts of why things happen the way they do, come from the experience of loss. So if you look at, primitive people dealing with loss, that might look like, why was there a flood? Why did our crops die? Why did a leopard come into our camp and eat the baby? And we create mythologies and we create narratives to try to rationalize this and make meaning of it. People have an innate need to make meaning of loss. And that's not the same as the earlier speaker was talking about is, everything happens for a reason, but we do crave meaning. And when you're doing grief counseling and working with grieving people whose children have died, people whose loved ones have died in terrible ways, suicide and violence, that's what they're looking for. Like, what does this mean? Why did this happen? And of course, we can't give them an answer. So a lot of them turn to their religion for an answer. The problem is they don't find the answer there. And then when they don't find the answer, they begin to have a crisis of faith, and that complicates the grief process so that they're not healing in a productive way that sort of follows the normative trajectory of grief. I don't want to say recovering, but we don't say grief recovery, we say restoration, restoring balance. So here's how that all starts. And this is what we call embedded theology, the theology that we got as children. Most of us get our theology when we're 2, 3, 4, 5 years old from our parents, from the community around us. Maybe we go to church in the family. It's put into our heads as soon as you're able to speak, that God created the world in 7 days and Adam and Eve and God makes the rain and all this stuff. When you ask a 2-year-old what God is, that's the kind of stuff that's immediately put into us. And then as it gets a little deeper and deeper, it's God punishes you when you're bad and rewards you when you're good. Then we end up with Santa Claus embodying that for us. It happens to be Christmas time right now, so I love the timing of this. And we have this story that's embedded from childhood. Most of us never think about it again. It's just in there. we go about our lives. And unless we are pursuing a career in theology and really choose to study this stuff deeply, it just sits there. We never think about it. The only time it ever comes up and comes up for questioning is when a loss happens, when something tragic happens and we go on that quest for meaning. So now you're 40 years old and your wife dies, or your child dies, or you lose everything in a flood, or whatever the loss is. It's no different than it was when we were living in caves. We're going to seek some sort of meaning. But we're not creating the mythology from scratch because it's been created for us and it's been fed into our heads. And so when you're 40 years old and you're dealing with something like this and looking for spiritual meaning, you're responding with the brain of a 5-year-old or with the theology of a 5-year-old. And that's the best tools that many people have for finding meaning and coping with loss, because they haven't thought about it or improved upon it or added to it since they were 5. And so what happens with loss and trauma is that it shakes up our assumptions. So we have certain assumptions about how life is supposed to work. For example, children should not die before their parents. Marriage should last forever. If you get in your car and you drive to the store, you have an assumption that you're going to make it to the store and come home safely. If we didn't have these assumptions, we would never leave the house. We also have assumptions that if we get a good job, it's going to provide us with enough money and we'll be secure, so we can buy a house and a boat and whatever. And then the assumption is that we're going to be safe, that it's a safe and benevolent world, that we're protected by our income, by our health, by all of this. And for some people, the belief is that they're protected by their religious faith. If I'm a good person, if I go to church, if I tithe, if I'm faithful to God, then bad things won't happen to me. And if bad things do happen to me, Jesus will be right there fixing it, taking care of it for me, and I'll be fine. And that's where we get into petitionary prayer. There's a talk here at this conference tomorrow on that I'm very much looking forward to. So the tragedy comes, the assumptions are blown away, and you're left in this kind of, lost world, the dark night of the soul, many of the theologians and the early Christian mystics called it, where you don't know what to believe anymore. And so what do you do? How do you fill that back up? Do you fill that back up, or you just stay in that lost place? And remember, now you're grieving. Something terrible has happened. Your 18-year-old son killed himself 2 weeks ago. You're in this state where all your assumptions, all your beliefs, social and spiritual, are in a state of flux, and yet you're going through this horrible pain of this horrible loss. This is where this isn't really where this is where deliberative theology could have been helpful. So we started out with the embedded theology that we were taught as children. Deliberative theology is what probably all of us have done, is we made a concerted effort throughout our lives, or at some point in our lives, to study theology, to study comparative religion, to study the psychology of the religion, and to really take it apart and unpack it and create a new theology or non-theology or whatever it is. We went in and we looked at it and we did the work. And remember that most people don't. Okay, hold on. I'm going to look at this question in the chat room. Just 1 second. Okay. Let me see who asked this question. Okay, so someone's saying, I understand that it's not appropriate for a chaplain to impose their theology on someone who's grieving, but what about guiding the mourner through the proper way to understand death using critical reason, starting from the chaplain's own metaphysical assumptions about the nature of reality? No. The answer to that is no. Chaplains, we do not guide them to anything. This is what's so sticky about being a chaplain. I can't say what is the proper way to understand death. I know what works for me. I know what works for a lot of people, but here is somebody whose kid just hung himself in the family garage. This is not a time to start talking philosophically about the meaning of death and the nature of reality. That's the tricky thing about being a chaplain. You're there in the moment of deep, acute crisis. And nobody can deal with that level of thinking. Sometimes as a chaplain, the best thing you can do for somebody is give them a glass of water and help them to calm down their breathing. This is where trauma training is really important in chaplaincy. So no, we don't go into deep philosophy with them. Now, if we've got a patient who is in a place where they're questioning philosophy and theology, then yes, we can help them. I have a great story about that. So I had a patient in the hospital once, a man who had just been diagnosed with something, and he was given like 3 months to live. He was probably in his late 60s, early 70s. This was in a rural community, very politically conservative, very Christian. And when I came to see this man, he asked me this question. He said, "Chaplain, where do you think Muslims and Buddhists go when they die?" That's a fun question. I love talking about that stuff, but it's not really appropriate there for him to ask me that. And the proper answer is for me to say, "I have no idea. What do you think?" This is how we're trained. We reflect it back on them because it's really for him to figure out on his own. I'm not going to talk to him about the 49 days of the Buddhist bardo or the Muslim afterlife and judgment in the grave and all this stuff that I know as a theologian about these different religions. That's not appropriate. The appropriate thing is to make him the star of the show. So I say to him, "It's an interesting question. Why do you ask? Why do you ask this question?" And he said, "Well, because I know that I was a sinner all my life, and I'm afraid that I'm going to go to hell, and that's where all the Muslims and Buddhists are." So that was his theology. That was his way of thinking. Now, what I want to do in a perfect world is try to talk him out of that kind of, bigoted, horrible thinking, but that's not going to happen in this 25-minute visit with him in his hospital room. So again, his theology is his business. I'm not there to educate him or to guide him. I'm there to help him find a little bit of peace in this moment and help him walk toward his death in a more peaceful way. So he's got all this anxiety about going to hell because he's a sinner. So when you have somebody like that, again, my job is to help them come to some sort of peace with this so that they can die a little more peacefully. I'm not going to change his thinking. But what you do with the theology is, and I'm now conflating this with another patient. Let me move off of this guy for a minute and give you another guy who had a similar thing. He was a biker and a meth dealer. This is another example. And he was also given a terminal diagnosis and had the same fear. I'm afraid I'm going to hell because I was a bad guy. I sold drugs to teenagers. I beat up women. I was a criminal. So what you do with that, again, instead of trying to talk him out of his theology, is to get him to unpack it himself. And so what you say to that man is, "Well, what does your faith tell you?" Oh, by the way, I'm sorry. I should have prefaced that with him saying that he's a Christian now. He was this bad guy, but he became a Christian. Okay, so you're a Christian now. What does your faith tell you about being saved and going to hell? And I just dumped it on his lap and let him process it. And he goes, "Well, according to my faith, as long as I'm with Jesus, I'm forgiven. So all the bad things I've done in the past don't count anymore, I guess, because now I'm with Jesus and I'm forgiven." And I'm not going to say, "Yes, that's right," or "No, that's wrong." I just leave him there with that. Well, if that's what your faith says, and that is where your heart is, and you believe that, then I guess you're forgiven. You're good to go, dude. Ponder that until I come back and see you next week. So it's very different. So no, we don't ever talk somebody out of a negative theology. That's my point. We let them sit with their negative theology. Now, after I have that conversation with them, I might go home and write a paper about bad theology. but I'm not going to bring that into the conversation with the patient. It's not the appropriate place. Okay, so let's see. Let's talk about bad theology. I want to give you some definitions of toxic theology. And as I said, there is research on this. There's a lot of it. You can Google it. A really good source there's a book by William Morrow called Toxic Religion and the Daughters of Job, where he uses the book of Job, as sort of a foundation for questioning all these beliefs about suffering. And he defines toxic theology as, I'm reading this to you, any system in which legitimate human experience and responses are shamed by religious institutions and systems. So, a normal human response and experience is, having a sex drive, perhaps, engaging in illegal activities, or, being unfaithful to your spouse, or any of the things that would be considered sins. And that's a long, long list, depending on, which denomination and sect you're talking to. But normal human experiences, being gay, whatever. Any of these normal human experiences are shamed by the religious institutions. So there's one description of toxic theology. And he says that the monotheistic faith in ancient Israel, the God of Israel, where most of these moral codes came from, contains shaming potential. It's all about shame. If you've studied the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, as we call it now, this God that was created by this particular tribe of people is a psychopath. And just, randomly tortures people when they do not worship him according to the way he would like to be worshiped. It's absolute narcissism. And the people are constantly shamed for not living up to his expectations. If you know anything about being in an abusive relationship, you'll know what that's like, is no matter what you do, you cannot make that person happy enough to treat you decently, because it's impossible, because that person, has a personality disorder. That's the God of the Old Testament. It's impossible to be in his good graces. And that's what the book of Job, of course, I can't say that it teaches us anything. It just tells us a story about it. So here's some other definitions. Perfectionist, retributionist doctrines in which natural human experience does not match up with the moral requirements of demanding religious rules. Traditional religious theories of justice and judgment can create cognitive dissonance, for example, when a death seems senseless. So, as you know, some Christian beliefs systems are based on the idea that we shouldn't die. The reason we have death is because of the fall from grace, of the fall from the Garden of Eden. That was one of the punishments for human beings, is that you will now experience death. I see people in the hospital all the time who believe this. And, they're like, oh, I'm dying. This is because of original sin. And, we're all sinners, and we're all going to die because of Eve. And I wouldn't laugh out loud in front of them, but when I think about that, I see somebody facing their death with all this complicated stuff coming into it, as if facing your death or facing the death of a loved one isn't hard enough. You now have all this theological stuff to sift through, and it complicates the process. And I'll get to that in a minute. Let me give you some more definitions of toxic theology. When a religious doctrine limits spiritual experience to merely accepting beliefs and doctrines, an authoritarian power hierarchy that demands obedience, policies of separatism. If you look at religious cults or high demand religious communities, you're not supposed to hang out with anybody outside that community. That's where we start looking at toxic theology. In children who grew up with religious abuse, that kind of religious abuse is They grow up in a Jehovah's Witness cult or Mormon or whatever, and they're only allowed to interact inside their own community. They're only allowed to read the spiritual or religious texts, no TV, no music, no dancing, nothing outside that small circle, which is restricted access to outside information. And there's a threat-based reality. You are always under constant threat of punishment or hell. God is also always watching. If you talk to adults who were raised in these kinds of high demand religious communities, they will tell you as children that they believed that God was this big man in the sky who was always watching them. So every single thing they did, they were on constant high alert, constant trauma stimulation, expecting to be punished. So of course they grow up with sexual issues because God's watching you masturbate. That's a huge stumbling block for people. And when you look at people who are in religious trauma therapy now, their sexuality is a mess because of this. And anything else that you're doing that God wouldn't like. And there's a whole list of things that God wouldn't like. And in fact, in Scripture, there's a long list of things that God hates. And it is actually in Scripture, God hates this, that, and the other thing. You can look it up. And of course, there's psychological mind control techniques that encourage isolation. We don't want to be with those people. Everybody in our group is blessed by God. Everybody else is going to hell. And I added a couple of my own definitions to what the scholars are saying. And I would say followers are held to a rigid, static system of belief. Questioning and exploration is discouraged. Outsiders are viewed with suspicion. Religious pluralism is unacceptable. If you're Protestant, you don't like Catholics. If you're Catholics, you don't like Protestants. If you're Christian, you don't like Jews. That kind of stuff. And you can't, mixing and matching is not acceptable. We're not allowed to cherry pick. You have to stay strictly within the doctrine. The belief that God rewards piety and faithfulness, and bad behaviors are punished by God. And here's a big one: natural disasters, epidemics, and community tragedies are curses from God. And you will find, if you look at a lot of these evangelical social media influencers, whenever there's a natural disaster, you'll hear the Pat Robertsons of the world, saying God, the earthquake in Haiti was God's punishment for gay people. So there's that belief system too, that there's this God in the sky that does this. So if you are in that belief system and you encounter this terrible tragedy, what's that going to do to your restoration process? Hold that thought. I'm going to come back to that in a second here. I want to tell you a story about some kids that I worked with in a grief group for middle school kids. These kids were 11, 12, 13 years old, and they had all lost a parent by one cause or another. And we were doing art therapy. So there were these three boys, and they were sitting there drawing, and I was walking around listening in on their conversations. And the youngest boy, no, he was the oldest boy, he said, I don't know if my dad went to heaven. He was a bad guy. He was a drug addict. He died from drugs. So is he in heaven, or does he go to hell for that? And the next kid says, oh, no, he's fine. He can go to heaven because God forgives everyone. And then the third kid, who was the youngest, he said, well, if God forgives everyone and they all go to heaven, then is there room for all those people up in the sky? Like all the millions of people that have ever lived? This is the youngest kid. And so I'm watching these three children just broken from these tragic deaths of their parents. And because of their embedded theology, their religious upbringing, they are asking these deep theological questions. And these are great questions. I would love to sit in a room full of kids asking these questions and, helping them sort through that. Not in my role as a chaplain. As a chaplain, I wouldn't do that. But as a teacher, in a religious studies class, I would definitely help them get to a more rational way of thinking. So what happens to these kids when they go home from that therapy group and they ask their questions of their parents? Is dad in heaven or is dad in hell? Depending on the parents' theological outlook, what are they going to answer? What are they going to tell the kid? They might say dad's fine because he was a Christian and he's in heaven with Jesus. But what if dad wasn't a Christian? Dad never went to church. What's mom going to tell this kid? Mom isn't going to really know what to say because she's never really thought about it. She's still in her 5-year-old embedded theology. There was another kid in the group whose mother had died from suicide. And he was always told, he was Catholic, and he was about 13 years old, that suicides go to hell. Suicide is a mortal sin. I guess it's a mortal sin, or I don't know what the names of the sins are. And so if that kid has a conversation with his grandmother and she says, yes, your mother's in hell because she killed herself, there's religious trauma right there. That's where it starts for that child. And he's going to, unless he grows up to develop a deep interest in theology and studies it through historical critical method, like we've done, who knows what that's going to do to him? He's going to spend his whole life thinking his mother's in hell. And his grief process is going to be complicated. So let's talk for a minute about complicated grief. So, to put this in really, really simple terms, and I see that my friend Lorinda Williams is here. Hi, Lorinda. She's a hospice chaplain too, and we know each other. We talk about this all the time. In really simple terms, you can say there's a healthy grieving process and an unhealthy grieving process. That's really an oversimplification, but we can say that, and current grief theory now shows us this. Let me back up. In 1930, Sigmund Freud wrote a paper called Mourning and Melancholia. And he had a theory about how to deal with grieving people. And his theory was that you should grieve and cry and feel the pain and look at all the old pictures and the memories and kind of get it out of your system so that then you will be done with it. And when you're done with it, you will separate from that relationship with that person and close that door. That was the theory for the next 30 years or so. In grief theory, that started to change in the 60s, influenced by a lot of things, not the least of which was Buddhism coming to the West and incorporating some of Buddhist ideas on attachment and suffering, sorry. And so that started to change. So the new theory now is continuing bonds, that you don't end your relationship with that person. You continue having a relationship with the dead person. It's just in a different form. You dream about them. You can communicate with them. You can do like a little ceremony for them every year on the anniversary of their death. You can set a place at the table for them at Thanksgiving. There's all kinds of things you can do other than just cutting them off. And that's why we don't use language like let go and move on, etc. We have new language for that now. And we have new theories about returning to restoration from grief. And the theories are that there are tasks and steps that you take. Now, everybody knows Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages. And I will tell you with absolute certainty, nobody with any knowledge or training in grief work uses that. That was thrown out a long time ago. What she did in her study was she interviewed very casually, it wasn't a formal academic study, 200 patients in hospitals that were given a terminal diagnosis. They were facing death. And so they had a lot of responses, like depression and anger and denial and bargaining. But they also had other responses like guilt or shame, anxiety, perhaps relief that their suffering might be over, all kinds of stuff. And she found that these 5 responses, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, were the most common. So that became her work, these 5 things. A few years later, maybe more than a few, a guy by the name of David Kessler took her 5 stages and applied it to grief. He wrote a book. Her book was called On Death and Dying. He wrote a book called On Grief and Grieving with her blessing. And he applied those 5 stages to grief. And that's when the whole thing went to hell, because those stages you can only go through if you're anticipating the loss. I'm anticipating my death. You can't bargain after somebody's died. You can't deny that they've died. Well, you can, but that's pathological. So anyway, that's a little bit of history on grief theory. So what we have now instead is the tasks of grieving. And the tasks are pretty simple. Hold on, I'm looking to see if I can find them here so I don't have to remember them. They're basically things that you do. They're actual actions that you take. So for example, the first task is to recognize the loss. And that's why if you have somebody who dies and perhaps they're missing in action in a war or a kidnapped child and you don't see a body, you have trouble recognizing the loss. So it helps to do that, recognize the loss. Then the next task is to recollect and reminisce and recall the relationship rather than trying to push that all away. Spend some time in the relationship. Look at the old pictures. Take their clothes out of the closet with a group of friends in the house, drinking champagne and smelling the clothes and hugging them. Just lean into the pain and actually do that. There's reconstruct the new world, adapt to the new world without the lost object in it. So these tasks. And so what we find is that if people can go through these tasks, these steps, they're not stages, they're actions. They're action steps, that they tend to regain equilibrium within not a fixed amount of time, but an expected amount of time. For example, if your 95-year-old mother dies and she's been sick for many years and she's in a nursing home, that's a normal expected death. You're going to go through those tasks and in about a few months, you're going to be fine because this was not a tragic death. If your 5-year-old child is hit by a car in front of your eyes, that's more difficult, obviously. But even with that, you are able to restore to a certain level of equilibrium and function after a certain amount of time. What happens in complicated grief is that you don't restore. And so I can give you some samples of that. Let me look at Darren's question in here really quickly. He's asking if psychic mediums are a healthy way for someone to process grief. Okay, that is a great question. Thank you.
Actually, in response to the question from Dr. Kramer above it, if you'd like to answer.
Oh, I didn't see that. Okay, thank you. I'm glad. Okay, so keeping communications with loved ones, this gets into metaphysics. I personally believe that we do receive dreams and images and connections. That is my personal belief. That has nothing to do with any religious context of any kind. And it's actually encouraged in healthy grieving. We have processes like write a letter to yourself from your loved one. Now, is the loved one actually writing the letter? I don't know, but it's a process that really helps people. So if I was writing a letter to myself, it would start with Dear Terry, and I would write this letter from the person who has died. And I might just put anything in there that I feel like I want to hear, like, you're a great person. You took such good care of me when I was sick. I'm so proud of you, or whatever. That is actually a process that helps. And many people really feel the presence of something coming through. You can do this through meditation, through visualizations. Dreams are very important. There's been a ton of studies on this. This has been looked at. Psychic mediums. I know tons of people who go to psychic mediums, and it can be helpful immediately, but long-term it becomes harmful because it becomes an addiction. So people will go to a medium and like once a month, like a therapist, and get the same messages over and over again, and that becomes pathological. Whether the medium is legitimately bringing messages, in my personal opinion and in my experience, I have seen that happen in ways that seem indisputable. And I'm not talking about all the mediums that you see everywhere, but I have seen a few bring in what we consider evidential information. For example, let's say, I'm answering this question from Chris. So let's say, Chris, the medium says, okay, Chris, your mother is coming through and she's telling me about the little blue box that she gave you when you were 12 years old that she told you not to open until you got married. There's no way anybody would know that except you and your mother. And I have seen mediums pull in things like that. And so that's a whole other conversation. In fact, we're going to be talking about that in the conference on death, grief, and belief that I am producing in July. So we can get to that. So, it's a tool for comfort. Let's say that. It is comforting for a lot of people, but if you go to a crappy medium, that's going to add to your complicated grief, because that's just the same as a religious failure, isn't it? So you put your faith in the medium and the medium gives you a bullshit reading, then again, you're going to have that same religious disappointment that Jesus didn't come and save your mother on her deathbed. I forgot what I was talking about. Complicated grief. So here's an example of complicated grief. A woman that I met told me once that all 4 of her children had died over a 25-year period in separate, unrelated events. One died as a baby, one died as a 10-year-old, the other one went to a war and was killed, and the other one as an adult, died on his motorcycle. And she said to me, I thought if I was a good person and I pleased God, that nothing like this would ever happen to me. So now that all my children are gone, all I can think about is, what did I do to displease God? And if I could just find out what it was, what little sin, what little mistake I did, then I would find peace. And as long as she's looking for that thing, that little missed sin, she will never find peace, because there is not that thing. That thing doesn't exist. So the only thing that she can do to find peace is to change the way she understands God. So she would say to me, why would a loving God let this happen to me? And I can answer that question. Here's my answer. It depends what you think God is. If you think God is this parental figure that is there to look after you and protect you and reward you for your faithfulness, then the only explanation for why God would let this bad thing happen is that you did something to piss him off. That's what the theology says. So if that's not making sense for you, if that's not, if that's putting a square peg in a round hole, then the next step is to rethink your image of God. Maybe God isn't that thing. And that goes back to the conversation we were having earlier with Chris, I think it was, about, there's a whole world full of different images of God. We could look at the Buddhist idea where God is not a being. It doesn't have an opinion. It doesn't make things happen or punish. God is just, the force. It's just nature. It's just the natural creation of everything, I guess, or it's collective consciousness. It can be all kinds of things other than the embedded theology of the man in the sky who's watching us all the time. So that's an example. So that woman had complicated grief. And because she had been struggling with this question, she'd been asking herself for all these years, she had all kinds of physical ailments. She wasn't that old. She was probably in her early 50s. But she had, pretty much every physical disorder in the book. She was depressed. She was on all kinds of medication. She was a mess. And that's what complicated grief can do. So here's another example. Another client of mine, her son died of leukemia when he was 10 years old. And she believed that this happened because God was punishing her for having an abortion 20 years earlier. So she believed that, having the abortion, that child, the new child, the one that died, God took that one to punish her for the one that she aborted. And she had complicated grief. The symptoms of complicated grief are, among other things, is, obviously clinical depression and, you don't come back to the world. You don't come back to life. Your marriage falls apart. Your social relationships fall apart. You can't go to work. Maybe you can't get out of bed in the morning. You drink too much, you eat too much, or you don't eat at all, and you start developing physical symptoms. That's just a really short version of what happens with complicated grief. Another example, and this one really isn't a religious one. This was another man I talked to, and I speak to at a lot of groups for parents who've lost children. And so this man came up to me after one of my talks, and I wasn't talking about this. And he said, he says, my son was murdered 6 years ago. And whenever I go out in public, like to the grocery store or the bank, and the clerk gives me my change and says, have a nice day, I say to them, I never have a nice day. My son was murdered 6 years ago, and you wouldn't understand until it happens to your child. This man actually goes out into the world and says this to people. So I said to him, okay, I completely understand how angry you are, but you have a choice. Anger is one option, and you can, it's 6 years now. You don't have to stay there. There's a whole world of other places you can go with this, and there's all kinds of help and support that you can get to moving into acceptance and peace. And he said, I don't want that. I want my anger. This is where I want to be. That's complicated grief. Now, why does he want his anger? Okay. This was an organization that I was speaking at. It's a national organization for bereaved parents. And I do speak out publicly against this group because it is run by untrained non-professionals. It's a completely peer-run and peer-supported group. And if you look at their website, nobody in their administration or on their board of directors has an academic degree of any kind. And they have chapters all over the country, and the people who lead the chapter meetings are other bereaved parents. The chapter leaders don't go through any kind of training. They don't learn group dynamics or grief theory or anything. And so what basically happens in these groups is people get together and commiserate and tell their stories over and over and over and over and over again. And they come out with certain philosophical ideas. And I hear these people say this all the time. The depth of your pain is equal to the depth of the love you have for your child, which is just about the worst philosophy in the world, because that means you don't allow your pain to lessen. If your pain lessens, then it means your love lessens, gets smaller. So I can spot somebody a mile away who's been in a group like this because they say these things to me. And they say things like, for the rest of your life, happy celebrations like birthdays and graduations and Christmas are never going to be happy. That is teaching complicated grief. Healthy grief is you do find joy again. You do have Christmas again, even though your loved one died on Christmas and it's so traumatic. I'm kind of veering off from toxic theology here, but it's important to understand complicated grief. So let's talk about, here's another thing that happens with toxic theology. A pediatrician friend of mine told me this story, and he had a 2-year-old with brain cancer that was on life support. The parents were Pentecostal, and they had organized their church and prayer groups all over the country. Thousands of people were praying that this child would be healed, would be miraculously restored from being days from death. And so the doctor, the pediatrician, said to the parents, we really need to have an end of life conversation to talk about how would you like to proceed in terms of taking him off life support, putting him in hospice. There's all the different things that we can do. And the parents said, no, doctor, we are not going to have that conversation with you, because God will know that we're thinking about that. And we'll know that we've given up our faith in him healing our child. If we start talking about hospice and removing life support, then we have failed in our faith. So, of course, the kid died. And where did that leave those parents? Unfortunately, I don't have the follow-up information on them, but I've seen it in hundreds of other people. And the question is, why didn't God intervene? We prayed, we did everything we were supposed to. What happened? It must be because there's that little lost piece of sin somewhere that we didn't do, or we weren't faithful enough. And that will lead you into complicated grief. So Darren is telling me we've got 20 minutes left. Do you want to do questions, or do you want me to keep going? I love questions and conversations. So if you want to turn this into a dialogue right now, let's talk about petitionary prayer. I'm going to say there's two kinds of prayer that you run into as a chaplain: petitionary and intercessory. Petitionary, all prayer is basically petitionary, the way most people do it, which is you petition God to do something for you. You ask God for something. Intercessory prayer is when somebody prays on your behalf. And they often ask chaplains to do that because as chaplains, they think that we have a direct conduit and a backstage pass to God, so that if we do the prayer, somehow it's more effective. So go ahead. And I will keep going until somebody interrupts me.
Dr. Daniel, if you have more to discuss, definitely hit your main topics. I definitely have questions for a Q&A session at the end.
Well, we can do that now.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I do want to bring up, Dr. Eller, who's in attendance, I think brings up a fantastic point. This is back when you were talking about talking somebody out of a negative theology. Is there a bit of hypocrisy in this? By talking somebody out of negative theology, are we not also just imposing our own theology on them, or our own positive theology?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why we don't do that. I mean, that's why, as chaplains, we don't do that. That's exactly right. Because if we're talking them out of a belief system, we're just by nature talking them into something else. Even if we're, talking them into just rejecting their belief system. As a chaplain, as a grief counselor, it's different. As a grief counselor, it's you're not talking them into or out of something, but you're helping them search. So as a grief counselor, if that lady said to me, all my children died because I displeased God, what do I do with this? As a counselor, that's really my job, is to help her figure out what to do with this. So I would suggest books to read, seminars to go to. I would work with her with like meditative and ceremonial processes to unhook from those belief systems, visualizations, writing exercises, art therapy. There's all kinds of processes, but mostly education. For her, I would give her some books about other types of theology. Not that I'm going to give her a book on Buddhism or Judaism, but I would give her books on other ways of thinking, even if it's something like Rob Bell, Love Wins. Okay, Christians love that book. Rob Bell was a very famous preacher who wrote books and started speaking about how the concept of hell isn't real. First of all, it's not biblical. And, he speaks against it. So for someone like her, who's a Christian, I would refer her to Christians like Bishop Spong, who question these theologies, and let her educate herself through that.
It still sounds like the goal is, or the thought is, with the count from you as the counselor, that there is a theology that is probably doing more damage than good, or is unhealthy, and that you're wanting to lead them to what you would consider a healthier theology. Is that still accurate to think that?
I wouldn't say lead them to a healthier theology. I would say unhook them from the one they have and let them land wherever they land. Because I'm not going to replace the theology with a new one. I'm going to teach them how to look at their theology critically.
Okay. Seraphim is in our audience as well. and actually asked a question that I was thinking as well. Does this oftentimes involve a Socratic questioning, where you're asking leading questions to kind of guide them to a thing, asking them to dissect it? Or is that too cerebral for somebody who's in the process of grief?
It depends. I mean, you certainly wouldn't do that, when somebody's 1 week out or 2 weeks out. Every single person is different. But with complicated grief, you get people who their loss was 5 years ago. I have a woman in one of my groups now whose mother died 5 years ago, who is still completely struggling. She doesn't feel like she can laugh or sing or be happy. She has all these religious beliefs about, things that she did wrong. Her mother wasn't very old. Her mother was only like 55. But it's been 5 years. So I'm working with her now. And what I do is mostly create a safe space for her to just spill out all her theological stuff. And we look at it together. We put it under a magnifying glass. I'm not, like I said, I'm not going to give her a book on Buddhism, but I'm going to give her a book by a Christian, well-respected leader, scholar who has himself done this questioning, and let her go along that path with him or her. And there's a lot of them out there because as you probably know, religious thought is changing. The American religious landscape is changing. And there are so many Christian leaders who are going through their own kind of deconstruction, and they're leading, setting a path for other people to follow. So somebody who's 5 years out from grief, yes, I would definitely do that. If they're 2 weeks out from grief, I wouldn't even touch it. I would just let them sit with it until they ask. So the example of the woman who lost all 4 children, she asked me the question, why would God do this?
That makes sense. One question I had earlier on was, is there on average, we recognize that people grieve over different lengths of time, but on average, about how long before somebody can start to engage in a more rational or cognitive dealing with their grief?
That is the big question. And there's no answer to that because everything is different. But here's something that will interest you who are psychologists here. The DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, in 2014 added a new diagnosis for complicated grief. And because it was getting conflated with clinical depression, and so they wanted to say that if a person has the symptoms of depression, first check to make sure they're not grieving, because those same symptoms also look like grief. So don't treat them for depression if it's only grief. And so that's why they put that in there. And it's very controversial because it actually says, how the DSM works, like there's like check boxes. And they'll say, if this person is still experiencing these symptoms after 6 months, you can diagnose them with complicated grief. And grief experts think this is just horrendous because if you came home from work and opened your garage door and found your 18-year-old kid hanging himself from the rafters, you're still going to be depressed in 6 months. 6 months would be just a cruel thing to put on you. But if it's your 90-year-old mother in the nursing home, 6 months would be reasonable. So it all depends on the circumstances of the death. So you could ask me, what's a reasonable time to grieve for your 90-year-old mother? And I'd say, yeah, 6 months. What's a reasonable, well, you're always going to grieve. So, but to be in active grieving, we don't like to put a time stamp on it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just want to clarify, as I think there may have been equivocation here, where does the DSM say after 6 months of the complicated grieving, then they can be diagnosed with clinical depression? Is that
no? After 6 months of symptoms, they can be diagnosed with complicated grief. Complicated grief is now its own diagnosis.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. And the symptoms are like, lethargy, overeating or drinking, loss of interest in social contacts. They're basically very much like symptoms of depression, right? And that's why they had to differentiate it.
And the problem is, though, that somebody could be just naturally grieving and it hasn't risen to the severity of complicated grief. Is that why it's so?
Yes,
okay.
Exactly. Yeah. So again, if you found your 18-year-old kid hanging in the garage and you're still lethargic and, socially withdrawn in 6 months, that still seems kind of okay. But then you have to look at other factors, like, are religious beliefs getting in the way? What kind of social and family support do you have? Then we get into the characteristics of resilience. And this is really interesting too. And the APA actually defines resilience. I actually have it right here. And so it depends on just kind of your natural aptitude. I don't know if aptitude is the right word, but let's see if I can find that here. Otherwise, okay. So here are some definitions of resilience: the capacity to make realistic plans and act on them. So you have this tragic death, and that capacity means that you can finally take the kids' clothes out of the closet and give them to Goodwill. Maybe make a little special, altar in your house for them, but maybe change the bedroom into a guest room, making decisions. Maybe you decide that you can't stay in that town anymore because in that house where he died, so you sell your house. These are making, decisions and acting on them. Some people can't do that, or some people can do it better than others. Another quality is skills in communicating and problem solving. Can you talk about your feelings? Do you have anybody to talk to? Do you have skills in looking at a need and addressing it? Like, the house needs a new roof. Oh, I can't deal with that. I don't want to call the contractor. Some people can do that. Some people will just let their house fall down. So that feeds into it too, as to how people are going to respond and whether they're going to get into complicated grief.
Thank you so much for that clarification. And again, anybody at any time can chime in. I have a list of questions, so I can always just speak. But if you want to chime in, unmute yourself and pop in with the conversation. Otherwise, I'm curious to know, since this is an atheist conference, have you encountered very many atheists who are requesting the chaplains, and what kind of conversations are engaged there?
That's a great question. It's funny. If you're a chaplain in a hospital, you look at the chart. When you check into a hospital, you check a box, right? What's your religion? Christian, Jewish? You get like 3 choices. So atheist is not one of those check boxes. It should be. So we don't really know what we're going to find when we walk into a patient's room. So you walk in, you say, hello, I'm Terry, I'm the chaplain. I'm just here to visit you and chat with you and give you some emotional support. And my favorite response is sometimes they say, oh, no, I don't believe in God. And I say, good, I don't believe in that God either. And then we can have a conversation. The problem is the word chaplain. So if I walked into that same person's room and I said, hi, I'm Terry, I'm a grief counselor, I'm going to get a much different response because there's no religion attached to it. So in the chaplaincy world, we struggle all the time with trying to come up with a different title because chaplain gives you that image. And so the atheists won't talk to us. Most Jewish people won't talk to us. Everybody else likes to talk to us. Now, it's different with a hospice because you're having a longer term relationship with somebody. And so you can get to know them better. And we do, when somebody comes into our hospice, we do a very detailed spiritual evaluation. So we can hopefully get, what do they believe in? What kind of spiritual practices are they? Do they believe in like universal consciousness or Jesus died on the cross or whatever it is? And then we know what to talk to about them. And a lot of them don't want to see us.
Interesting. Any closet atheists where they have been outwardly a practicing believer, goes to church every Sunday, whatever, but confide in you? Actually, I don't really believe in any of this.
Oh, yeah, that happens all the time. I mean, even some of the chaplains are like that. I mean, I have a friend who's a rabbi and she calls herself an atheist rabbi, so, and we know that there's a whole thing of, atheist believers, which is not even that they're in the closet, but they want some kind of spiritual, metaphysical life. They just don't want it to be put in that box. So they could call themselves an atheist spiritualist. This is another semantics thing that we struggle with all the time. Like someone came up with the term I think it was like intellectual mystic. Like, I'm kind of into mysticism, but I'm approaching it more from a rational state. You just strip away all the theology and the doctrine, and you can still be a mystic. And yes, somebody just mentioned Richard Rohr as a Christian theologian like Rob Bell. There's also, oh my gosh, why can't I think of his name? Matthew Fox. So these are the kinds of people that I would give to Christians to help them begin deconstruction. But, if you yourself have ever deconstructed, you know that it's not just something you flip a switch overnight. It's a process. You have to really work through it. It takes years for some people.
The fundamentalist in me, the former fundamentalist in me hears you say, well, I might help them deconstruct the belief system, or I might point them to some of these other Christian authors who, as a former fundamentalist, I would have said those were heretical guys. Mm-hmm. So it's funny because part of me immediately jumps and says, so you're pointing them to bad theology, or just as bad, or you're pointing them to heresy, kind of a thing.
Well, a fundamentalist would certainly say that. Yeah, a fundamentalist would say that Matthew Fox is the devil, and even Rob Bell, who I'm not a big fan of Rob Bell because he's still a Christian. He still isn't quite deconstructed himself. I wrote a paper on him and didn't like him too much. But again, I wouldn't. Okay, so let's say I have let's use this example of the woman whose 4 children died, and she's still a Christian. She's deeply into it, and she's questioning. I'm not going to give her Richard Dawkins to read. That's just like, you can't rip somebody's armor off. You have to help them very gently through the process. Otherwise, you're just re-traumatizing them. And like you said, you're just throwing another theology at them.
Would you consider giving them the literature from somebody like Jerry Falwell that's more in line with their already existing beliefs? Now, and I'm not saying a book that's bashing the homosexual community or anything like that, but it's something that he wrote on grief. And he's in line with their beliefs. Or are you directing them out of a conservative theology?
Well, that's a really good question. So I'm not aware that Jerry Falwell ever wrote anything on grief, but I think if he did, it would not be good, because there is actually something called appropriate Christian grief. And the belief in the fundamentalist Christian stratosphere about grief is that you're not supposed to grieve. It's even in the Bible. Paul said it. It said, we don't grieve like other people, because it's in Romans, I think, because we know that our loved ones are in heaven. So why are you crying? You should be happy. And so Christians like that feel very guilty about grieving. And they've also been taught that anger is a sin. You don't show anger. And they're very angry. A drunk driver crashed into their husband's car and killed him. They're very angry. And then they struggle with, well, anger is sinful. We're not supposed to be angry. And I'm so sad and I'm crying that my husband is gone. And why did God take him? And you're not supposed to question God either. So that's probably what Jerry Falwell would say. I'm guessing that's what his grief book would say.
It sounds like what you're saying is you're not necessarily attacking or trying to correct the theology as much as from a position of a grief counselor. You recognize that maybe some of the actions and statements that they're directing towards themselves is not helping the grieving process and isn't helping them emotionally. We can deal with the theology, the more doctrinal and cognitive stuff, cerebral stuff later. But right now, it is bad, toxic theology that's actually hindering the grieving process. Is that correct?
Yes. But again, this is somebody who's down the road a ways. This isn't in the first week or the first 2 weeks. This is, if you were doing a grief group, which I do all the time. I mean, I've got people whose loved one died 2 weeks ago and people who someone died 10 years ago. And we don't really talk about theology in these groups, but if it was one-on-one, I would approach both people differently, again, if they ask. And I'm also a teacher. So to me, my counseling is also teaching. That's a really big part of it. I don't really like one-on-one talk therapy kind of counseling. It actually isn't effective for grief. So there's like two things that grieving people really need. They need to be heard. They need someone to listen to them because their friends and family members are tired of hearing about their pain and aren't comfortable being with their pain. So they need somebody who can listen and be comfortable with the pain. And they need to know that there are other people suffering like they are. So that's why grief groups are good. But that's only good up to a point. That doesn't carry on for months. Okay, somebody's listened to you. We've heard your story. You've told your story. You've shared your story with others. You can't just do that over and over and over again into infinity. At some point, you need education and tools. So I kind of go straight to the education and tools. That's more my style because I'm an educator. And so when I do counseling one-on-one with people, I don't schedule them once a week or once a month. I have maybe one meeting with them. I give them stuff to read. I give them some processes to do. And I tell them to call me when you want to talk again. I let them do the work on their own. That's the kind of counseling I do. It's different.
That makes sense. Thank you so much for that clarification.
Yeah.
We have a couple more minutes. So if anybody else has any questions, you can type it in the chat box or you can pipe up right now. Otherwise, Dr. Daniel, if there were any other topics or any other clarifications that you
there is actually one thing I want to show you. I'm going to draw it for you. Do we have like 2 or 3 more minutes?
Yes.
Okay. I don't have a blank piece of paper. Try to visualize this one. So I want to give you an example of the kind of processes that I give people. I have something called the grief and growth genogram. It's really a timeline. And I have them draw a line on a piece of paper of their life, starting with birth. And then I have them put on the line little markers of all their losses. Okay, can you see that? There's the markers. Okay. Now, this is a technique that some grief coaches do in grief groups where they'll do this and they'll have you say, okay, here's where my father died. Here's where I got divorced. Here's where my dog died. And they just leave it there. That's the whole process. Draw a picture of your losses, which I think is terrible technique. So I built upon this and I said, okay, here's your losses. Now I want you to go back to this piece of paper and I want to put another line that shows a decision that you made about that loss. And this one's going to be a squiggly line. Okay, I don't know if you can see this. There. And so let's say that this is, my father died when I was 5, and the decision I made about it was that I'm abandoned and nobody will ever take care of me. And then over here, my husband left. And the decision I made, subconsciously is that men can't be trusted and I'll never love again or whatever. Then you go back and you do a third line, and this one's in another color. And the third line is what changed in your life after that event. And that's post-traumatic growth. And that's what I'm trying to have them see. So there's the third line is red. I don't know if you can see that. And so that's where, okay, my husband left me. I made a decision that I would never love again. And then I met somebody else and fell in love and had a happy marriage. Or, I lost all my money in the stock market crash and I made a decision that, I'll never be stable again. And then I went back to school to get trained for a new career so I could make more money. And then I found the career of my dreams. I mean, I'm just rattling this stuff off. But the point is, this is the kinds of exercises that I give people to do in grief counseling so that they're actually doing work rather than just telling stories.
And the goal is to help them identify how they have, in fact, moved on a bit, if that's an appropriate term, that they've coped and carried on.
They have regained equilibrium.
Okay.
And they've moved into the new world that they've adjusted and created without the lost object.
Excellent. And I can see that being really useful when in the midst of grieving, recognizing that very likely the grief will expire or will end eventually or will dissipate.
It will change. It changes into something else. It deepens you. It changes your perspective. You want it to change your perspective. I mean, something that big can't happen to you and have you stay exactly the same. You don't really want to stagnate. So it's going to change your thinking about something. It could make you like that guy who goes into the bank and tells people about his murdered son. I guess that changed his thinking, but it put him into a really dark, really unhealthy place. So one way or another, whatever way it goes, it is going to change you.
Okay. Well, as we wrap up, would you please talk about your upcoming conference and the code that you had for it, I believe?
Yeah. So I have a conference coming up. It's called, this is the website. It's called the Conference on Death, Grief, and Belief. And it's talking about exactly what we're talking about here. If you can copy and paste that. I think you can also find it on the webpage here for this conference because you've got our logo up there. But deathgriefandbelief.com. And if you would like a $40 discount, it's a live conference, live in person in Portland, Oregon. And so for the members of this group, I'm giving a $40 discount code. So if you want that code, go to that website, click on the email link and send me an email and let me know that you were part of this group, or I can put my email address in here. It's really easy. Oops. It's office@deathgriefandbelief.com. So let me know that you're interested and I'll send you the code for the $40. It's going to be a really amazing conference. I've got Seth Andrews as my keynote speaker on Friday night, and the two guys from Thank God I'm Atheist podcast, and a bunch of excellent scholars. I've got Muslims and rabbis and all kinds of people talking about toxic theology in their tradition. And yes, there will be an online component. We're not going to do a live stream, but we're going to have the recordings. So you can go to the website, click on the registration link, and just purchase the recording package.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Daniel, for doing all this and for being so insightful and sticking around for clarifications and dialoguing with me about this. I think it's incredible work and very important work on so many different levels, so many different reasons. So, and thank you for sticking it out with our brothers and sisters that are grieving and hurting and dying in the world. Yeah. Thank you for that.